It had been screaming for 10,000 years, but in the 41st millennium, that scream had become something physical. A wound torn across the stars themselves, a gash in reality so profound that light bent away from it and sanity dissolved at its edges. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum. Sailors of the void called it different names in different tongues, but every name meant the same thing. The end had begun, and it was taking its time about it. On the world of Fenris, where oceans froze between seasons, and the sky ran with auroras the color of old blood, something came through. It did not arrive like a warp breach. No screaming tear in reality, no demon stench, no psychic shockwave that drove mortal minds to ruin. It arrived the way a storm arrives before you see the clouds. A pressure change, under a silence falling over animals that had no business being silent. A sensation among the rune priests of the space wolves that the oldest word in their language had just been spoken aloud by a voice they had no name for. The wolves of Fenris, the great Fenrisian wolves, beasts that had survived glaciers and sea monsters, and the passage of Primarchs, lifted their heads from their kills and went utterly, completely still. And then he stood on the ice shelf above the Fang, and the wind did not move him. He was tall in the way that mountains are tall, not merely in measurement, but in implication. One eye the color of a winter sky before snowfall. The other socket wrapped in ancient cloth, a wound so old it had become philosophy, a gray cloak that moved without wind, a spear in one hand, its head glinting with runes that predated every language currently spoken in the Imperium of man by approximately 45,000 years. A raven on each shoulder, and the ravens were looking at things that were not there, or perhaps at things that had not happened yet, which in this universe amounted to the same terrible possibility. Odin, Allfather of Asgard, King of the Aesir, God of wisdom and war, and the honored dead, stood on an alien world in a universe that had never heard of him and took a long, slow breath. It tasted of blood, old blood and new blood, and the specific, irreplaceable stench of faith weaponized, of billions of human beings burning their hope into something so concentrated it had become toxic. It tasted of the warp, not the ordered, navigable, mystical currents he understood from the Nine Realms, not the structured rivers of cosmic power that Asgardian sorcery drew from. This was something rawer, hungrier, an ocean of pure mortal emotion left to fester across 10 millennia until it had developed its own terrible intelligence. He had felt something like it once, long ago, when he had hung on Yggdrasil, the world tree, 9 days and 9 nights, a spear through his side, no food and no water, sacrificing himself to himself in exchange for the wisdom of the runes. The warp felt like that moment stretched across geological time. Every mortal fear, every scream of a dying world, every prayer offered to a god who did not answer, all of it curdled into something that called itself divine and was anything but. This, Odin thought, with the particular calm of a being who had looked into the void at the bottom of Mimir's well and chosen to keep looking, is a universe in tremendous trouble. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, shifted on his shoulders. Munin pressed close to his ear and delivered what she had gathered in the crossing. Fragments, impressions, a tapestry of information assembled from whatever passed for the collective unconscious of this dying galaxy. Billions of humans, thousands of worlds, an empire held together by a god who could not speak, ruling from a throne that was also a torture device, sustained by the deaths of thousands of psychers every single day. A galaxy where 4 entities of pure chaos, old, vast, and ravenous, had been growing fat on 10,000 years of war. And the All-Father processed this in approximately 3 seconds. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a growl, and Gungnir's runes flared briefly gold against the white of the Fenrisian ice. Worse than Ragnarok, he said to no one in particular. Ragnarok at least had the decency to be scheduled. He had come here because of the wound in the sky, the great rift that his ravens had spotted from the edges of a collapsing dimensional boundary, a breach so massive it had bled outward into adjacent cosmological structures. He had come because wherever reality tore, something always tried to crawl through, and Odin had made it his business across uncountable ages to be present at tears in the fabric of existence before the wrong things noticed them. He had come, if he was being honest with himself in the way that only the very wise or the very tired can manage, because Hugin had shown him the shape of this galaxy's suffering, and something in his ancient chest had recognized it. He knew what it looked like when a people had forgotten why gods existed. Gods existed to carry what mortals could not, to stand at the edges of the dark and hold the line not because they were invincible, he had one eye and a prophecy of his own death to prove otherwise, but because someone had to, and gods were built for the bearing of terrible weight. The Imperium of man had a god. He had seen the shape of that god in the warp's echo as he crossed. Vast, brilliant, ancient, and utterly, heartbreakingly silent, chained to a machine, spending every fraction of his divine consciousness just to keep the lights of the Astronomicon burning so that ships could navigate a galaxy that was trying to digest itself. Odin stood on the ice of Fenris for a long moment, looking up at a sky split by the faint, distant glow of the Great Rift. He had given an eye for wisdom. He had given 9 days of agony for the runes. He had given his son, not Loki's schemes, but older losses, deeper ones, for the continuation of a cosmic order that was always, always one crisis from collapse. He recognized this place, not the planet, the situation. The ravens lifted from his shoulders simultaneously and vanished into the auroral dark to begin their work. Yes, Odin turned toward the massive structure visible on the mountain's flank, a fortress of a scale that would have impressed even the architects of Asgard, and began to walk. Below him, in the depths of that fortress, the locals called the Fang, alarms were beginning to sound. Rune priests were waking from meditation with their third eyes blown wide open and their mouths forming words they hadn't chosen. And Logan Grimnar, great wolf of the space wolves, was pulling on his armor with the particular focused calm of a man who had seen impossible things before and fully intended to headbutt this one until it made sense. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. A hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The All-Father walked toward the Fang, and the Fenrisian wolves parted before him without being asked, and the oldest instinct in their engineered blood told them, correctly, that this was not a thing to challenge. This was a thing to escort. Even apex predators recognize an apex. The Fang had stood for 10,000 years. It had been carved from the bones of Fenris itself, a mountain fortress so vast it scraped the upper atmosphere, its spires lost in perpetual cloud cover. Its foundations sunk so deep into the planetary crust that geologists had stopped trying to measure them and simply written unknown in the relevant field and moved on with their lives. It had weathered orbital bombardment, demon incursions, the assault of a chaos war fleet under Magnus the Red himself, and the particular brand of creative destruction that occurred whenever space wolves celebrated a significant victory indoors. It was, by any reasonable military or architectural assessment, indestructible. It had never in 10,000 years of standing had its front approach walked by something like this. Logan Grimnar met him at the outer gate. The great wolf of the space wolves was not a small man. 3 centuries of warfare and tactical dreadnought armor had left him with the physical bearing of something that geological processes usually took millions of years to produce. His beard was a weapon in its own right, white and vast and braided with the bones of enemies significant enough to commemorate. His axe, Morkai, double-headed, crackling with runes of wolf and winter, was in his hands not in threat, but in the instinctive way that a man who has carried a weapon for 300 years carries it always, as an extension of self rather than a declaration of intent. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that Fenrisian wolves' eyes went when they were deciding whether something was prey or whether. Behind him, arrayed with the casual discipline of warriors who had learned that standing at attention was less useful than standing ready, were 40 space wolves in full battle plate. Rune priests among them, psychic warrior shamans in armor hung with pelts and carved antlers, were visibly struggling. Their eyes kept trying to roll back. Their lips moved in the old Fenrisian words for things that had no modern translation. Velva, weird, or the one who sees from the tree. Grimnar looked at Odin for a long time, long enough to be rude by most civilized standards. By Space Wolf standards, it was practically a warm greeting. "You're setting off every ward in the Fang," Grimnar said finally. His voice had the texture of gravel being processed by industrial machinery. "Every rune priest we have is having visions. Brother Stormcaller is speaking in a language none of us recognize, and he's been doing it for 20 minutes, and whatever he's saying, the servitors are writing it down because it feels important." He paused. "Who are you?" Odin regarded him with his single eye. When there was something in the Allfather's expression that was not quite amusement and not quite assessment, the look of a being who had spent an eternity watching mortals be simultaneously more and less than they imagined themselves to be. "You know who I am," Odin said. "Your blood knows, even if your mind is working to reject it." Grimnar's jaw tightened. The axes' runes pulsed. "I know what the legends say. I know what the Fenrisian people believed before the Allfather of the Space Marines was laid upon the throne. I know what our own chapter's mythology holds." His eyes narrowed fractionally. "I also know that the warp is full of things that are excellent at wearing faces that mortal minds want to see." "A wise concern," Odin said, and something shifted in his tone. Approval, genuine and unguarded. To Mwanya, a leader who accepts comforting visions without skepticism is a leader already halfway to ruin. Test me if you need to." Grimnar gestured once. 3 rune priests stepped forward simultaneously, their force staves crackling with psychic energy patterned in the old Fenrisian forms. Wolf runes, storm runes, the binding sigils that the chapter's shamanic tradition had maintained since the days of Leman Russ himself. The energy hit Odin like weather hits a cliff face. Present, acknowledged, entirely insufficient to move him. The rune priest stopped. One of them, young, perhaps only 80 years in service, sat down heavily on the frost-covered stone and said something in Old Fenrisian that made the older warriors around him go quiet. Grimnar looked at him sharply. "He says," the eldest rune priest translated, his voice careful and deliberate, "that this being's soul is older than the Astronomicon, older than the Emperor's first psyker tests, that his connection to the threads of fate makes our own sight look like a candle next to a star." A pause. "He also says that the ravens are watching us from directions that don't exist, Great Wolf." Grimnar was silent for 3 full seconds, an eternity for a man of his temperament. Then he did something that surprised his warriors. He lowered Mordecai, not far, not all the way, but the gesture was legible. "Come inside," he said. "Whatever you are, you're not chaos-born. Chaos-born things don't make the wolves sit down and refuse to move." He glanced at the Fenrisian wolves still flanking Odin at a respectful distance, their massive heads low, their behavior somewhere between reverence and the specific calm of animals that have encountered something above their threat assessment threshold. They haven't done that since Leman Russ left. The name landed in the cold air with particular weight. Odin walked through the gate of the Fang, and the fortress, 10,000 years old, scarred by sieges and orbital strikes, and the wrath of a Primarch's brother, seemed to settle fractionally around him. The way old structures sometimes settle when a long-absent load-bearing element is finally, unexpectedly, returned to its proper place. In the Great Hall of the Fang, with its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, and its walls hung with the pelts of monsters and the banners of 10 millennia of campaigns, Logan Grimnar and Odin Allfather sat across a table made from the spine of something that had been enormous even by Fenrisian standards, and the great wolf poured 2 cups of Fenrisian ale, an act of hospitality so ingrained in the chapter's culture that it overrode even tactical caution, and asked the question that was burning through every rune priest's third eye simultaneously. "What do you want?" Odin accepted the cup. Examined the ale with the appreciation of a being who had invented the concept of mead halls. Drank. "I want to understand this galaxy," he said. "I want to know what that wound in your sky is, what feeds it, and what it costs to close it." His single eye settled on Grimnar with the weight of something that had stared into the void at the base of reality and kept its composure. "Henron, and I want to know about the Emperor." The hall went very quiet. Grimnar's hand tightened slightly on his cup. Around the hall, veteran warriors who had faced demon primarchs and the horrors of the Eye of Terror shifted with the particular discomfort of men who had been asked to discuss something sacred and terrible simultaneously. That, Grimnar said slowly, is not a simple conversation. No, Odin agreed. The important ones rarely are. Outside the Fang's walls, far above in the screaming Fenrisian atmosphere, something watched. Not with eyes, with the particular multidimensional awareness of an entity that did not experience observation the way mortals did. In the impossible architecture of the warp, in the ever-shifting labyrinthine realm that existed adjacent to real space, like a nightmare pressed against the back of a mirror, Array the Changer of Ways turned approximately 9,000 of his attention threads toward the new variable that had appeared on the board. Cinch did not have a face in any meaningful sense, but if he had, it would have been smiling. A god of wisdom had arrived in his galaxy, a god ancient enough to predate the Chaos Pantheon's current dominance, a god who had sacrificed pieces of himself for knowledge and who carried in his single eye more understanding of fate and sorcery than most of the Imperium's greatest psychers accumulated across entire lifetimes. The pieces on the board were moving in ways that had not been predicted, and Cinch, whose nature was change itself, whose eternal game was the manipulation of fate's threads, felt something he experienced very rarely. Genuine interest. In the Fang's great hall, Hugin landed silently on the table between Grimnar and Odin. The raven looked at the great wolf with an intelligence that was uncomfortable to meet directly, then looked at his master and made a sound that was not quite a caw, more like a single word in a language that Grimnar's mind translated involuntarily, the meaning arriving not through his ears, but through whatever deep and ancient thing the rune priest called the word sense. The word was watching. Odin's expression did not change. I know, he said quietly. Let it watch. I have been watched by worse. He reached out and smoothed Hugin's feathers once, a gesture of such ordinary tenderness that it made the assembled space wolves, veterans of horrors beyond civilian comprehension, feel inexplicably as though they were witnessing something private. She tell me, Odin said to Grimnar, everything. The telling took 3 hours. Grimnar was not, by nature, a verbose man. He had spent 3 centuries making decisions that other men spent weeks deliberating, and he had learned that economy of language was a form of respect. For the listener's time, for the weight of the subject matter, for the dead who were the inevitable subject of most military histories. He told Odin about the Emperor in the way that space wolves told everything, directly without ornamentation, with the specific reverence of warriors who loved their god, not as an abstraction, but as the reason the lights were still on. He told him about the Horus heresy, about 10,000 years ago when the Emperor's greatest son had turned and half the legions had followed. Hun and the galaxy had burned in a civil war so catastrophic it had never fully recovered. About the siege of Terra and the duel at the heart of a traitor flagship and the price the Emperor had paid to end Horus, a price that had left him a ruin of a being, alive only in the loosest technical sense, sustained by machinery and sacrifice, and the collective faith of 1 trillion souls who would never meet him. Odin listened without interrupting. This, too, was a form of wisdom. He asked 3 questions across the entire 3 hours. The first, how many psychers die to sustain the Astronomicon daily? Grimnar told him, roughly 1,000. The word landed in Odin's expression like a stone into still water. A single ripple, then stillness. But the depth beneath was visible. He asked the second question, has anyone spoken with the Emperor directly since his interment? Grimnar hesitated, then spoke of Robout Gilliman's return, of the Primarch who had stood in the throne room and come away shattered by what he had experienced. Something communicated, something vast and terrible, but nothing that could be called a conversation. The third question Odin did not ask aloud. He simply looked at the ceiling of the great hall for a moment, and every rune priest in the room felt their word sense spike like a blade through cloth. And then the All-Father returned his attention to Grimnar and said nothing, which was somehow more unsettling than anything he might have said. It was during the silence after the third question that the Vox alert sounded. The communication came from a rune priest stationed in the Fang's upper Auspex towers. The vast sensor arrays that monitored Fenris's surrounding void for the constant and reliable parade of threats that characterized existence in the 41st millennium. His voice was controlled in the way that Space Wolf voices were always controlled when reporting something that would have caused a lesser soldier to simply start screaming. Great Wolf, we have 3 vessels translating from the warp in high orbit. Identification codes are... A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be significant. Inquisitorial. Black ships. One is broadcasting Ordo Hereticus frequencies. The other 2, another pause. Grey Knight Heraldry, Great Wolf. The Great Hall went very still. Grey Knights, the Emperor's own demon hunters. On the secret chapter that officially did not exist, whose very name was classified at levels that made Inquisitors nervous, who existed for one purpose and one purpose alone, the destruction of demonic and warp-born threats of the highest magnitude. They came when something had appeared on the Imperium's psychic threat assessment that defied any other solution. They came specifically for things like an unidentified, god-level psychic entity that had appeared on Fenris broadcasting enough warp resonance to be detectable from 3 star systems away. Grimnar looked at Odin. Odin looked at Grimnar. Something passed between them, the specific understanding of 2 very old warriors who had both just recognized that a situation was about to become significantly more complicated. They'll want to purge you, Grimnar said, not unkindly. Not factually. They'll try, Odin said with the same factual tone. I'd prefer they didn't. Speaking with them will be more useful than the alternative. His single eye held a quality that Grimnar was beginning to recognize. The look of a being that was constantly running calculations about consequences, about chains of cause and effect extending decades or centuries beyond the present moment. The Inquisition. They are your empire's internal judges, the ones who decide what constitutes heresy, among other things. And the Grey Knights are their weapon against the warp, against demons specifically, things that come from the Imperium, things that wear false faces. Grimnar's tone contained a specific warning. Reasonable, Odin said. In a galaxy where the warp is full of ancient malevolent entities that wear the faces of gods, having warriors specifically trained to kill such things is not merely reasonable. It's essential. I hold no grudge against the instinct. He set down his cup. But I will not be destroyed by men who haven't had the conversation yet. The Grey Knights did not wait for an invitation. They came through the Fang's upper landing platforms with the specific efficiency of warriors who had planned the insertion before they landed. 4 squads in silver Aegis pattern power armor, force halberds and nemesis weapons crackling with sanctified psychic energy, led by a Justicar whose helmet bore the markings of a Brotherhood champion. Behind them, walking with the particular authority of a man who had long ago decided that authority was simply a function of certainty, came Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn. Eisenhorn was old in the way that only radical inquisitors got old. Not the artificial prolonged youth of rejuvenate treatments maintaining a surface appearance, but genuinely, visibly, expensively old. The kind of old that came from spending a century and a half making decisions that cost pieces of the soul. His coat was black. His eyes were the color of old silver. He carried a sword at his hip. Barber Satyr, those who knew him knew. And a bolt pistol with the casual disregard of a man for whom these were not weapons so much as punctuation marks. He stopped 12 feet from Odin. The Grey Knights arrayed themselves with textbook precision, a containment formation, force weapons at angles calculated to maximize coverage. The psychic baffles, built into their armor, humming as they assessed the warp resonance of the entity before them. In their training encompassed every classification of demonic intrusion, every known warp entity, every chaos god's servants and emanations. Their mental bibliotheques were the most comprehensive demonological records in the Imperium. None of it contained anything remotely like what was standing in the Great Hall of the Fang. The Brotherhood champion's voice came through his helmet's vox, carefully modulated. Unidentified entity, you are radiating warp signature in excess of any classification in our records. You will submit to binding and assessment, or you will be destroyed. These are your options. They are not, Odin said pleasantly. The force halberds came up. The psychic charge in the room doubled. Several servitors in the hall's periphery quietly shut down from the ambient pressure. Eisenhorn raised one hand, not to stop the Grey Knights, but in the specific gesture of a man who wants a moment to think before committing to an action he may not be able to undo. His eyes moved across Odin with the systematic assessment of a man who had spent a century and a half categorizing impossible things. The absence of demon stench, the absence of chaos corruption in the warp signature, the ravens, the runes on the spear that his mind kept sliding off of, unable to fully process their age. The reaction of the space wolves, warriors who should, by every operational doctrine, have already attempted to secure or destroy this entity. Standing instead with the complicated body language of men caught between duty and something older than duty. "You're not a demon," Eisenhorn said. His voice was precise, academic, so stripped of inflection. A man running calculations aloud. "No," Odin agreed. "You're not chaos-aligned. No, you're not a Primarch, a Cetan, an Eldar god remnant, or any Xenos deity in our records. Also, no. What are you?" The question carried beneath it the full weight of a man who had seen enough impossible things to know that this question mattered more than any tactical consideration currently in play. Odin was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a being choosing its deception, but the quiet of a being choosing the most accurate version of a truth that was genuinely difficult to compress into terms a mortal mind could process without structural damage. "I am what your emperor was before the throne," he said finally. "A being of immense age and power who chose to sacrifice pieces of himself. And I, time, comfort, pure certainty, in exchange for the wisdom necessary to protect those in his care." His single eye moved from Eisenhorn to the Grey Knights, to the Space Wolves, to the vaulted ceiling of the hall and back. "I am a god of wisdom and war, who has arrived in a universe where the gods are all either rotting on thrones or screaming in the dark. And I would very much like to understand why, because in my experience, the Odin force flickered gold at the edges of his cloak, briefly, like a coal-catching light. That situation is not permanent unless no one does anything about it." Eisenhorn stared at him for a long time. Then he looked at Grimnar. "You believe him." "My rune priests believe him," Grimnar said carefully, "which is not precisely the same thing. But in 30 years of working with rune priests, I have learned that the distinction rarely matters." Eisenhorn looked back at Odin. The Grey Knights had not lowered their weapons. They would not, Eisenhorn knew, until he gave the order. And he was not yet certain which order to give. His hand moved to his sword hilt, not drawing, just resting. The unconscious gesture of a man organizing his thoughts through the familiar weight of a weapon. "You said the Emperor was what you are," Eisenhorn said. "Past tense." "Yes," Odin said quietly. "You've seen him. In the warp. His echo, his shape. What remains visible from the outside of whatever that machine is doing to him." Something moved in Odin's expression. Not quite grief, but the philosophical cousin of grief. The look of a being that had seen enough sacrifice to recognize its signature across any cosmological distance. Hold on, he is still in there. Still thinking. Still burning. A pause that carried enormous weight. "He is very tired." The great hall of the Fang was absolutely silent. In the warp above Fenris, Sinch's attention threads multiplied. Eisenhorn did not sleep that night. This was not unusual. Inquisitors of his tenure and temperament had long since made their peace with insomnia as an occupational condition. There were simply too many things in the galaxy that required worrying about at 3 in the morning, and Eisenhorn had personally added several new categories to that list over the course of his career. But this particular sleeplessness had a different quality to it. It was not the restless churn of tactical anxiety or the specific dread that came from knowing something terrible was coming and being unable to stop it. It was the sleeplessness of a man who had spent a century and a half constructing a precise, functional model of how the universe worked, and had just watched someone walk through the wall of that model without noticing it was there. He sat in the quarters the Space Wolves had provided, sparse, cold, smelling of Fenrisian pine and old stone, and he reviewed everything he knew about the entity in the Great Hall. Warp signature, immense, ancient, and entirely without the corruption markers that characterized every demonic or chaos-aligned entity in the Ordo's records. The psychic profile was consistent with something that predated the Chaos God's current dominance of the Imperium, which, if taken at face value, implied an age that strained credibility. The Grey Knight's librarians had confirmed what the rune priests had reported: no taint, no deception signature, no evidence of the psychic masking techniques used by greater demons impersonating benevolent entities. Whatever it was not lying about its fundamental nature, which left Eisenhorn with a problem that was almost philosophical in its complexity. What did the Inquisition do with a genuine god? Not a chaos god, not a Xenos deity, not a psychic gestalt, or a warp entity that had fed on worship until it achieved something approaching divine status. Something older. Something that had arrived in this universe carrying its own cosmological framework, like a man carrying a lantern into a cave. The light was real, it was his, and it had absolutely nothing to do with anything that lived in the cave. When he was still working through the implications when his Vox chimed. The message was from his ship in orbit, encrypted. Priority Vermilion, the classification above extremis, reserved for situations where standard urgency designations had proven inadequate. His senior acolyte's voice was carefully controlled in the way that indicated the situation warranted the opposite of careful control. Inquisitor, we have warp translation signatures, multiple, bearing consistent with approach from the Prospero debris field. A pause. Identification is, the profile matches Thousand Suns Chaos Space Marines Inquisitor, approximately 40 signatures, with 3 larger readings consistent with Chaos Sorcerers of senior rank. They're not broadcasting, they're running silent and coming in fast. Eisenhorn was on his feet before the message finished. Shermain, the Thousand Suns. Magnus the Red's Shattered Legion. Once the finest scholars and sorcerers in the Imperium's history, now servants of Tzeentch, their mortal bodies reduced to animated armor filled with crystallized psychic dust. They're sorcerers among the most dangerous practitioners of forbidden knowledge in the galaxy. They had attacked the Fang before, 10,000 years ago, in the burning days of the heresy. They knew its layout. They knew its weaknesses. And they were coming, Eisenhorn understood with the cold clarity that decades of pattern recognition produced, for Odin. He was moving through the Fang's corridors at something approaching a run, undignified, but the occasion warranted it, when he nearly collided with the Allfather himself, who was walking in the opposite direction with the unhurried calm of a being that already knew what was coming and had decided to go and meet it personally. You felt them, Eisenhorn said, not a question. Hugin told me, Odin said. 43,000 Suns warriors and 3 sorcerers of the sect they call the Corvidae. His single eye held something that might have been dark amusement. Appropriate. The Corvidae are Tzeentch's seers. They work in ravens and riddles. He glanced at the empty air beside his shoulder, where Hugin and Moonin habitually perched. My ravens are better. You know about Tzeentch. I know about the entity that has been watching me since I arrived, Odin said. Immense. Ancient. Obsessed with knowledge and change, and the manipulation of fate's threads. His voice was measured, almost clinical, the tone of a scholar describing a subject rather than a soldier describing an enemy, though in Odin's case the distinction had always been largely academic. In my experience, entities of that nature make their opening moves through proxies. They do not commit directly until they understand what they're dealing with. He paused. I have spent the last 3 hours being very deliberately interesting so that the proxy attack would come before I reached Terra and became difficult to intercept. Eisenhorn stopped walking. You baited them, he said. I gave them an opportunity, Odin said. There is a distinction. A baited trap is designed to catch. An opportunity offered to an enemy on ground of your choosing is designed to learn. The Odin force flickered at his cloak's edges again. That brief, gold coal luminescence that the rune priests had been trying not to stare at for 3 hours. I want to see how Tzeentch's servants operate. I want to understand the rules of the magic in this universe before I commit to using it at full capacity. And I want the Grey Knights to see me fight something they recognize, so that Inquisitor Eisenhorn can update his assessment with empirical data rather than theoretical concern. A long silence. "You've been doing this longer than I have," Eisenhorn said finally. "Yes," Odin agreed. "Come, they'll breach the outer wall in approximately 4 minutes, and I would prefer to be outside when they do." The breach came in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Close enough to be gratifying. And the Thousand Suns hit the Fang's outer defensive line with the characteristic precision of Tzeentch's chosen. Not the howling, headlong assault of Khorne's berserkers or the shambling tide of Nurgle's plagues, but a calculated geometric attack designed to maximize confusion and minimize predictable response. Rubric Marines, the hollow, dust-filled suits of enchanted armor that had once been living warriors, advanced in perfect formation, bolters firing in overlapping arcs calculated to suppress every known defensive position simultaneously. Behind them, 3 figures in ornate armor, blazing with warp fire, directed the assault with the cold efficiency of chess players who had spent 10,000 years studying the board. The Space Wolves met them with the characteristic enthusiasm of warriors who had been waiting 3 minutes and 40 seconds for something to hit, and were now extremely relieved to have it. Odin walked through the outer gate into the firefight, and the Thousand Suns stopped. Not strategically, not tactically. They stopped the way that automatons stop when a signal interrupts their programming. A full, complete, system-wide pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds and cost 17 Rubric Marines their existence as Logan Grimnar and his Wolfguard, who had not stopped, used the interruption with the pragmatic efficiency of 3 centuries combat experience. The pause was because the Rubric Marines had no minds left. They were psychic constructs, a dust given purpose by sorcerous direction, and the sorcerers directing them had just registered something in the warp space above the battlefield that their extensive training had not prepared them for. Something that looked, from the Imperium's perspective, like a star that had wandered into the wrong galaxy and hadn't noticed yet. Something old enough that the Thousand Suns' 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge suddenly felt like a child's first primer. One of the 3 senior sorcerers, Ahriman's school, Eisenhorn's trained eye told him, the Core Vitae Sex finest, raised his force staff and spoke a single word in a language that predated Low Gothic by 40,000 years. Odin spoke one back, in the same language, with better pronunciation. The warp above the battlefield buckled. What happened next was not a conventional magical duel in any sense that the assembled Space Wolves or Grey Knights had a framework for. There were no visible energy exchanges, no dramatic light shows of the kind that chaos sorcery typically produced. Instead, the air between Odin and the 3 sorcerers simply became heavy. The specific metaphysical pressure of 2 incompatible cosmological systems attempting to occupy the same space. The Thousand Suns warp sorcery was Tzeentch-aspected, fractal, multidimensional, operating through layers of probability manipulation and reality revision. It was extraordinarily sophisticated. It had been refined across 10 millennia in the direct service of a chaos god whose fundamental nature was the mastery of change. Odin's cedar was something else entirely, and it was not aspected toward any emotion or any specific cosmic force. It was simply true. The kind of magic that came from understanding reality deeply enough to speak its underlying language, from sacrificing enough of yourself that the universe trusted you with its grammar. Tzeentch's sorcery met Odin's cedar the way an extraordinarily complex machine meets an extraordinarily simple physical law. The machine was impressive. The physical law was not impressed. The 3 sorcerers went to their knees simultaneously, not dramatically, not thrown backward by some visible force, but with the specific, involuntary collapse of beings whose entire magical framework had just been told, very politely and very firmly, that it was operating on incorrect assumptions. The Rubric Marines, deprived of direction, stood motionless. The Space Wolves, pragmatic to the last, destroyed them efficiently while they stood. Eisenhorn watched from the gate, barbarized satyr drawn but unnecessary. The Grey Knights around him had lowered their force halberds 2 minutes ago without appearing to notice they'd done it. The senior sorcerer, the one who had spoken first, looked up at Odin from his knees with the eyes of a being in the specific agony of a man who has just realized that the thing he has spent his entire existence studying is merely a footnote in a much larger subject. "What are you?" the sorcerer said. His voice carried beneath it, faintly, the ghost of a scholar's curiosity. The echo of what he had been before Tzeentch's gift had hollowed him into something else. "Someone who has been asking questions longer than your god has existed," Odin said. Well, he looked at the sorcerer for a long moment, with something that was almost compassion. Not the soft compassion of mercy, but the harder compassion of a being that understood precisely what was lost when a mind capable of genuine wisdom was given to something that used wisdom as a commodity. "Tell Tzeentch that the proxy approach was instructive. Tell him I learned what I needed to learn." He paused. "Tell him I would prefer to have the next conversation directly." He turned away. In the warp, across the impossible architecture of the ever-shifting realm that was simultaneously nowhere and everywhere, the changer of ways processed the data from his failed proxy assault, revised approximately 47,000 probability calculations, and arrived at a conclusion that he had not reached about anything in several thousand years. And this required personal attention. The journey to Terra took 11 days. Not because the distance required it. With the right application of the Odin force, Odin could have crossed the galaxy in a fraction of that time, punching through dimensional boundaries the way Gungnir punched through armor. But he had spent enough centuries watching impatient gods make catastrophic decisions to know that arriving somewhere important before you understood it was merely a sophisticated form of blundering. He needed the 11 days. He needed to see the Imperium from the inside before he stood in its holiest place and looked at whatever remained of its god. Eisenhorn arranged transit on an inquisitorial black ship, one of the vast, grim vessels designed specifically for the transportation of psychers. Its Geller field reinforced to levels that made standard warp travel look like crossing a street. The Inquisitor had spent approximately 40 minutes arguing with himself about whether this was sanctioned, another 20 minutes arguing with a Grandmaster of the Grey Knights via encrypted Vox, and approximately 3 seconds making the actual decision, which told Odin everything he needed to know about the quality of Eisenhorn's judgment. Logan Grimnar sent 12 Space Wolves as an honor guard. He himself remained on Fenris. His chapter needed him, and the Great Wolf was not a man who abandoned his responsibilities for the sake of witnessing history, no matter how significant that history might be. But before Odin boarded, where Grimnar had stood at the landing platform's edge in the Fenrisian wind and said something that stayed with the Allfather across all 11 days of the journey. "Leman Russ left to find the Emperor," Grimnar said, 10,000 years ago, after the heresy, walked into the Eye of Terror and never came back. We've been waiting." The Great Wolf's gray eyes were steady and entirely unreadable. "I'm not saying you're him. I'm not saying you're the answer to the waiting. But if you get to Terra and you find something that can be done, something that requires doing, I want you to know that the Space Wolves will answer the call, whatever it costs." He paused. "That's not faith. That's a contract." Odin had looked at him for a long moment. "I understand contracts," he said. "I have hung on a tree to honor one." He had meant it literally. A Grimnar had understood that he meant it literally, which was perhaps why the Great Wolf had nodded once, with the respect of one warrior acknowledging another's sacrifice, and said nothing further. On the Black Ship, during the 11 days of warp transit that passed in the specific liminal unreality of Imperium travel, Odin read, Eisenhorn had access to inquisitorial archives that were not available to any living being outside the Ordo. Records stretching back to the early Imperium, classified histories of the Emperor's life before the Unification Wars, theological analyses, the compiled testimony of every psyker who had ever claimed direct contact with the Emperor's psychic presence. He provided them not out of trust, precisely, but out of the inquisitorial instinct that information shared with a powerful entity you couldn't destroy was marginally safer than information withheld from a powerful entity you couldn't destroy. Odin read everything. He read with the specific, unhurried thoroughness of a being that had learned the runes by staring at them for 9 days with a spear through his side. The kind of reading that extracted not just information, but implication, not just events, but the shape of the decisions that had produced them. He read about the Emperor's early life, the ages spent walking among humanity, the careful cultivation of civilization across millennia, the Primarch Project, the Great Crusade. He read about the Council of Nicaea, even where the emperor had banned the use of space marine sorcery, a decision with consequences that had echoed through 10,000 years of history. He read about the moment Magnus the Red, trying to warn his father of Horus's treachery, had torn through the wards on Terra with a psychic message so powerful it had catastrophically damaged the emperor's secret project beneath the imperial palace. He read about the Webway project. He sat with that for a long time. The emperor had been building a human webway, a network of stable, warp-independent transit tunnels that would have freed humanity from dependence on the perilous Imperium entirely. A project of such staggering ambition and complexity that it had required the emperor's personal attention full-time, conducted in absolute secrecy, when sustained by wards and psychic barriers that Magnus's well-intentioned catastrophic message had shattered in an instant. Demons had poured through the breach. The project had been destroyed. The emperor had been forced to abandon it to deal with Horus. And then Horus had almost destroyed everything else. What might have been, Odin thought, if the Webway had succeeded? A humanity that didn't need to trust its ships to the mercies of an ocean of predatory, psychic entities. A Imperium that didn't lose 1 in 3 vessels to warp anomalies. A civilization that could expand and communicate and sustain itself without feeding the chaos gods every time a navigator opened a route through the Imperium. The sacrifice of that possibility, not in battle, not by any enemy's hand, but by a single well-meant mistake, was, Odin thought, one of the most tragic things he had read in an extremely long life that contained a great deal of tragedy for comparative purposes. On the 4th day of transit, something tried to breach the black ship's Geller field, not subtly, not in the careful, patient way that minor warp entities tested boundaries, looking for weaknesses in wards and faith. It hit the field with the force of something enormous and extremely annoyed, and the entire vessel lurched in a way that sent unsecured equipment across compartments and caused 3 of the 12 space wolves to instinctively grab their weapons and look for something to shoot. Odin looked up from the archive text he was reading. He walked to the ship's prow observation deck, a reinforced chamber with a viewport that technically looked out into the warp, whilst though most people who used it kept the blast shield down for obvious reasons. He raised the blast shield. He looked into the Imperium. The warp looked back. What was pressing against the Geller field was not a demon in any conventional classification. It was a face, or rather it was the impression of a face assembled from approximately 17,000 faces simultaneously, each one shifting into the next before completing itself, each one wearing an expression of dazzling, multifaceted amusement that contained beneath it something ancient and entirely serious. It was vast in the way that only things that did not have a physical size could be vast. It filled the viewport not because it fit there, but because it chose to make itself perceptible at that scale. Tzeentch had decided to introduce himself personally. Now Odin stood at the viewport and looked at the changer of ways without expression for a long moment. Then he placed one hand flat against the transparent steel, a gesture that should have meant nothing, that had no tactical significance whatsoever, and spoke 3 words in a language that the warp itself did not have a name for, because it predated the warp's current inhabitants by enough millennia that they had never encountered it. The Geller field, which had been screaming under the pressure of the assault, steadied. More than steadied. It settled. The specific settling of a thing that has been reminded of what it fundamentally is, stripped of the anxiety that comes from being tested. The ship's navigator in her sealed sanctum at the vessel's heart, and I reported afterward that for approximately 30 seconds, the warp around them had gone completely, unnervingly calm. Not the false calm of an entity withdrawing to regroup, but the genuine calm of a space that had been, briefly and incomprehensibly, organized. Tzeentch's assembled faces cycled through expressions faster. The amusement remained. But beneath it, something else had appeared. Something that in a human face would have been called respect. Though in a chaos god's face, it looked more like the specific attention of a collector who has just identified an item of exceptional rarity. A voice came. Not through the Vox, not through the hull, but directly through whatever passed for the ambient psychic medium of the vessel, bypassing every ward and baffle as though they were suggestions rather than barriers. "Will you stabilize the Imperium?" the voice said. It was not a sound so much as a meaning that arrived pre-assembled, the way that certain truths arrive in dreams. "That is not a thing that has happened before. Not here. Not in this age. Your ocean is full of old pain," Odin said to the viewport. "Old pain without purpose. It makes the water choppy." He looked at the cycling faces with his single eye. "I have some experience with purposeful pain, which is why I recognize the difference." "You want to reach the corpse emperor," Sinch said. The title was not contemptuous. It was clinical, the descriptor of a being that had watched the emperor's decline across 10 millennia, with the detached interest of a naturalist observing a particularly long extinction event. "You think you can do something about his condition?" I think I need to understand his condition before I decide what can be done," Odin said. "There is a difference. Premature certainty is the enemy of effective action." "You sound like me." "I am nothing like you," Odin said, pleasantly but with absolute finality. "You collect wisdom to use it. I collect wisdom to bear it. The distinction is the difference between a man who studies the weight of things and a man who uses weights to break other things." A silence. The cycling faces slowed fractionally. "The other three will move against you," Sinch said. "Khorne already considers you a declaration of war simply by existing. Nurgle finds your resistance to despair personally offensive. Slaanesh is curious in ways that will not be pleasant." A pause that contained within it the specific quality of a being delivering information it found genuinely valuable to share, for reasons that were not entirely legible. "I am telling you this not as a warning. I am telling you this because the game is more interesting when the pieces know they are being moved." "I am not a piece," Odin said. "No," Tzeentch agreed. "That is precisely what makes this interesting." The faces withdrew. The warp returned to its standard state of churning hostility. The space wolves outside the observation deck, who had been standing very still and very ready for the duration of a conversation they had heard only one side of, exchanged glances that communicated a great deal without words. Eisenhorn appeared at the observation deck's entrance. He had, Odin noted, Anna arrived approximately 4 minutes into the conversation and had the specific expression of a man who has decided that the correct response to witnessing something unprecedented is to observe it very carefully and reserve judgment until he has more data. "What did it want?" Eisenhorn asked. Odin lowered the blast shield over the viewport. "To establish that it's watching," he said, "and to warn me about the others." He turned from the viewport. "The Chaos Gods are not unified. They are in constant competition with one another. Tzeentch told me about the other three not because he wanted to help me survive them, but because my conflict with Khorne, Nurgle, and Slaanesh serves his purposes." "He wants you fighting his brothers," Eisenhorn said. "He wants the board disrupted," Odin said. "In known a new variable introduced into a game that has been static for 10,000 years." His single eye held the cold clarity of a being doing genuine strategic calculation. "The question is whether I can use his interference to my advantage before he uses mine to his." Eisenhorn was quiet for a moment. "You're playing a game against a god of games." "I have played against fate itself," Odin said, "and lost, and learned from the loss, and played again." He moved toward the observation deck's exit. "That is the difference between wisdom and cleverness. Cleverness tries not to lose. Wisdom understands that losing correctly is sometimes the only path to winning eventually." He left Eisenhorn with that, and the Inquisitor stood alone in the observation deck for a long time afterward, doing the thing that had made him one of the Imperium's most dangerous servants, thinking very hard about implications. 6 days remained until Terra. In the warp, 3 vast and ancient presences that had not previously been paying specific attention to the new arrival in their galaxy shifted their considerable, terrible focus toward a single black ship moving through the Imperium on a heading for Holy Terra. Khorne's eternal rage found a new object. Nurgle began to hum. Terra was dying slowly enough that most people had stopped noticing. This was, Odin reflected, the most dangerous kind of dying. The kind that had been normalized across so many generations that it no longer registered as crisis, but simply as condition. The poisoned skies, ochre and brown, were pressing down on a planet that had been stripped of every natural resource it had ever possessed across 40,000 years of being the administrative heart of a galactic empire. The hive cities, structures so vast they made the Fang look modest, urban accumulations that had grown so large they had begun growing into each other, forming one continuous planetary surface of compressed humanity stacked kilometer upon kilometer in towers that disappeared into toxic cloud cover. 8 billion souls on a world that should have supported perhaps a tenth of that number, sustained entirely by off-world supply chains that the Great Rift had made catastrophically unreliable. The smell hit him first, even through the black ship's recycled atmosphere, as they made final approach. Not the clean cold of Fenris, but not the particular scent of a living world's biosphere doing its complex chemical work. Terra smelled of industry and incense, and the specific compound odor of too many human bodies in too little space for too long. It smelled of faith weaponized until it had become indistinguishable from desperation. It smelled underneath everything of the warp, not the corrupting stench of chaos, but the constant low-level psychic bleed of 8 billion souls in close proximity, their collective emotions seeping into the Imperium like heat through thin insulation. Eisenhorn had arranged clearances that should not have existed. Odin suspected that several inquisitorial career decisions of the irreversible variety had been made in the last 11 days to produce the authorization codes that allowed their shuttle to bypass every layer of orbital defense, atmospheric interdiction, and surface checkpoint between high orbit and the Imperial Palace's primary landing platforms. The Grey Knights accompanying them moved through checkpoints with the specific efficiency of warriors whose existence was classified above the clearance level of most of the soldiers manning those checkpoints. Nobody looked directly at Odin for very long. Not from fear precisely, though fear was present, a constant low hum in every human they passed. It was more the instinctive visual aversion that occurred when a person's eyes encountered something that their brain's pattern recognition systems could not successfully categorize. The pilgrims they passed in the processional routes, hundreds of thousands of them, shuffling in lines that had been shuffling for decades, come to Terra to die in proximity to their god, didn't look at him at all. Their eyes slid past him the way eyes slide past things that are too large to process as objects. The ravens drew more attention than Odin himself. This seemed appropriate. The Imperial Palace was not a building. It had been a building once, 10,000 years ago. The administrative center of a unified Earth, the seat from which the Emperor had launched the Great Crusade. It was now something that the word building was entirely inadequate to describe. It covered a significant fraction of Terra's northern landmass. It had its own internal weather systems. It contained within it cities, armies, manufactoria, shrines, fortresses, archives, and population centers that would have been significant on their own worlds. Walking through it was less like walking through architecture and more like walking through geology. The sense of being inside something that had been accumulating for so long that it had achieved a kind of mass, and at its heart, beneath the primary dome that had been rebuilt 11 times across 10,000 years, the Golden Throne. The approach to the throne room was a procession of escalating sanctity, each antechamber more heavily guarded, more extensively warded, and more saturated with the psychic residue of faith and terror than the last. The Adeptus Custodes appeared at the third antechamber, the Emperor's personal guard, towering figures in Oromite armor, whose presence communicated, without words, that everything beyond this point was protected by beings who had spent their entire existence, centuries, millennia, doing one thing and doing it with an absolute, terrifying completeness. Their captain, a figure whose armor bore the marks of 10,000 years of continuous service, whose eyes contained the specific quality of a being that had been watching the same tragedy unfold in slow motion for longer than most civilizations had existed. Looked at Odin. Odin looked back. The standoff lasted 11 seconds. Odin counted them with the patience of a being who had once counted 9 days, one heartbeat at a time. The captain stepped aside. Later, Eisenhorn would ask him what had passed between them in those 11 seconds. What had been communicated in the specific language of two ancient beings assessing each other across a threshold? Odin would tell him, nothing that translated into words. The custodian had looked at him the way that guardians look at things that are not threats to what they guard, with the recognition, earned through a very long professional intimacy with danger's actual face, that whatever Odin was, he was not that. That was all. But it was enough. The throne room doors opened. The heat was the first thing, not physical heat. The room's temperature was cold, made precisely maintained by systems that never failed, because failure was unacceptable. It was the psychic heat of something burning at an intensity that had no mundane parallel, a fire that produced no light perceptible to ordinary senses, but that pressed against the word sense, against the deepest layers of psychic perception, with the force of something that had been burning without cessation for 10,000 years and was doing so on will alone. Odin walked into the throne room and looked at the Emperor of Mankind. He had prepared himself. He had read everything. He had listened to Grimnar's careful descriptions and Eisenhorn's precise accounting and the Grey Knight's theological framework and the 1,000 years of imperial scripture that attempted to capture in language what was sitting on that throne. He had processed the warp echo he had encountered during his crossing, the shape of the Emperor's presence visible from the Imperium's exterior. He had believed he understood what he was walking toward. He had not. The Golden Throne was magnificent in the way that instruments of necessary torture are magnificent, with the cold beauty of engineering applied to a purpose so grim that beauty felt like an accusation. Tubes and feeds and neural connectors and energy conduits beyond counting, all converging on the figure at its center with the intimacy of something that had grown into its host rather than been attached. And in the center of it all, the Emperor, or what remained of him, which was simultaneously much more and much less than the word remained implied. The body was ruin. There was no softening that truth. So 10,000 years of the Golden Throne's sustaining degradation had reduced the physical vessel to something that the galaxy's greatest medici could not have classified as living by any conventional metric. And yet it was, unmistakably, irreducibly, heartbreakingly alive. The presence that inhabited it burned through the physical ruin the way a star burns through clouds, not diminished by the obstruction, merely filtered, its true scale visible only at the edges where the filter was thin. Odin stood in the throne room for a long time without moving. Behind him, Eisenhorn and the Grey Knights and the 12 Space Wolves held the specific stillness of people who understand that they are witnessing something that they may never fully understand and are doing their best to be adequate witnesses. So Hugin and Munin had not come into the throne room. They had stopped at the door and refused, gently but absolutely, to cross the threshold. Odin had not pressed them. Some things were beyond even memory and thought's capacity to process. He walked forward, past the rings of attending tech priests and their mechanical genuflection, past the incense burners and the prayer sayers, and the apparatus of 10,000 years of sustaining ritual. He walked until he stood at the base of the throne itself, close enough to feel the Emperor's presence not as ambient psychic radiation, but as something direct, something that was aware of him, specifically and precisely, in the way that oceans are aware of stones dropped into them. He placed his hand on the base of the throne, not on the Emperor, on the throne, at our gesture of contact rather than intrusion, and he opened himself. Not the careful, contained opening of a being managing its psychic exposure in a hostile environment. The guarded satyr he had been practicing since arriving in this universe, measured and deliberate. He opened himself the way he had opened himself on Yggdrasil, completely, without reservation, with the specific, costly vulnerability of a being that understood that some things could not be known from a safe distance. The Emperor's presence hit him like a planet, not in force. The Emperor did not exert force, not in any directional sense, not toward Odin. It simply was, in the way that gravity simply is, pervasive, enormous, and entirely indifferent to whether you had prepared for it. Odin felt the full weight of 10,000 years of sustained burning will, the sheer, staggering, inhuman effort of what the Emperor was doing, had been doing, every moment of every day since his body had failed him, holding the Astronomicon, maintaining the beacon that every navigating soul in the Imperium depended on to cross the warp without being devoured, burning himself continuously and completely to produce the light that kept humanity's ships from the dark. And beneath the effort, beneath the burning, beneath the vast mechanical labor of maintaining the light, he was there, still thinking, still present, still burning with something that Odin recognized because he had felt its echo in every human being who had ever looked at an impossible situation and decided to face it anyway. Hope, not optimism, hope. The specific, costly, a clear-eyed hope of a being that knows exactly how bad things are and chooses to keep the light on regardless. Odin withdrew his hand from the throne and stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to where Eisenhorn stood waiting. And the Inquisitor looked at the Allfather's face and saw something there that he had not seen in 3 hours of conversation on Fenris, or 11 days of transit, or the confrontation with Sinch at the viewport. Something that, in a lesser being, he might have called shaken. "Well?" Eisenhorn said quietly. Odin was silent for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. "He knows I'm here," he said finally. His voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something that had the quality of a man who has just looked into a depth he hadn't expected to find. He has been aware of me since I crossed into this universe. He has been waiting." A pause. "Not for me specifically, for anything, for any variable that might change the equation." His single eye moved back toward the throne, not at it precisely, but at the space around it, the shape of the presence that filled that space. "He is trying to tell me something. He has been trying for 11 days, since the moment I arrived on Fenris. But the throne is—" He stopped. "The throne is what?" Eisenhorn pressed. "It is consuming him," Odin said. "Not killing him. He would prefer killing to this. It is consuming the parts of him that could communicate. Every cycle he completes, every pulse of the Astronomicon, costs something that does not regenerate. Why, he is spending himself to keep the lights burning, and he has been doing it for so long that the currency is running out." He looked at Eisenhorn directly. "He is trying to tell me what he needs, but the message keeps being burned away before it reaches the surface." The room was very quiet. "Then how do we hear it?" Eisenhorn said. Odin's expression settled into something that Grimnar would have recognized. The look of a being that had already arrived at an answer it was not entirely pleased about. "The same way I learned the runes," he said. "The same way I found wisdom in Mimir's well." He looked back at the throne. "I go in after it." The argument lasted 6 hours. This was, by the standards of arguments conducted in the vicinity of the Golden Throne, relatively brief. Eisenhorn had spent longer than that in single inquisitorial tribunals debating the precise theological classification of entities that defied standard categorization. And at least those tribunals had refreshments. The throne room offered nothing so practical. It offered instead the specific, grinding spiritual pressure of a space that had been saturated with 10,000 years of desperate prayer, which had the effect on prolonged argument of a headache that existed just below the threshold of being acknowledgeably a headache. The custodian captain, Odin had learned his name was Tragan Valoris, shield captain, one of the oldest of the already ancient order, was immovable in the way that things become immovable after 10 millennia of practice. His objections were not hysterical. They were not even particularly emotional. They were the objections of a being that had spent his entire existence protecting one thing and had developed, through that devotion, a sensitivity to threat that operated below conscious reasoning. A bone-deep alarm that rang whenever anything approached his charge with intentions that could not be completely mapped in advance. "You are proposing to make psychic contact with the Emperor," Valoris said. His voice had the quality of something that had been refined by centuries into pure function. "An entity of unknown origin and cosmological alignment, proposing direct communion with the most sensitive and critical psychic structure in the Imperium." The answer is no. "The answer," Odin said patiently, "should be, what is the alternative?" "The alternative is that you do not attempt it. And the Emperor continues to burn himself away on a throne that is consuming him faster than faith replaces what it costs." Odin's single eye was steady. I have seen what is happening to him from the inside of his psychic presence. I have felt the rate of degradation. You have been watching it from the outside for 10,000 years, and you have normalized what you are seeing, because normalization is what beings do when they cannot fix a thing. But I am telling you, Shield Captain, with the authority of a being that has spent more years than this empire has existed studying the specific mechanisms of divine deterioration. He is running out of time in a way that your instruments are not sensitive enough to measure. Valoris was quiet. Not convinced, not yet, but quiet in the way that a very good guardian becomes quiet when presented with an argument that engages with his actual fear rather than his stated objection. His actual fear, Odin had understood within the first 20 minutes of argument, was not that contact would harm the Emperor. It was that contact would reveal something that could not be unfound. Some truth about the Emperor's condition that would, once known, change the Imperium in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. The custodian had been protecting the Emperor's flame for 10 millennia. He had also been protecting the idea of the Emperor, the symbol, the myth, the theological architecture that 800 billion human beings had built their entire civilizational identity upon. Those were not the same protection. And somewhere in 300 years of service, Valoris had made peace with that tension without resolving it, because resolution was not available. Eisenhorn said nothing throughout the argument. He had positioned himself against the throne room's far wall, with his arms folded and the expression of a man attending a chess match between players whose game significantly exceeded his ability to predict. He had offered his view once. Let him try. The risk of not trying is higher than the risk of trying. The Emperor's deterioration rate makes this a question of when rather than if, and having offered it, had retreated into the observation that had made him effective across a century and a half of impossible situations. The resolution came not from argument, but from the throne. It came as a pulse, not dramatic, not the kind of psychic emission that registered on instruments or sent people staggering. A single directed pulse of intent, perceptible only to those sensitive enough to receive it, which in the current throne room meant Odin, the Grey Knight's librarians, and the eldest of the Space Wolf rune priests who had accompanied them from the Fang. The rune priest, old enough that his beard had gone the white of Fenrisian glaciers, sat down on the floor without apparent self-consciousness and pressed both hands flat against the cold stone and said something in Old Fenrisian that the attending tech priest's lex mechanics translated after a 3-second lag. He says yes. Valoris stood very still for a long moment. And then he stepped back from the throne's approach path with the specific movement of a man who has just made the hardest decision of a very long life and is not going to revisit it. Odin prepared himself with the care that only practitioners of genuinely dangerous wisdom traditions understood. Not the theatrical preparation of magical display, no circles drawn or words spoken for effect. He sat cross-legged on the floor before the throne, which caused several of the attending tech priests to exchange glances that communicated genuine theological distress, a being of apparent divine nature adopting a posture of concentrated vulnerability in the most sacred space in the Imperium. He set Gungnir across his knees. He closed his eye. He had done this once before. Not this exactly. Nothing was ever exactly the same. But this kind of thing. When hanging on Yggdrasil, wounded and fasting, staring into the void at the bottom of everything until the void organized itself into runes, into language, into the deep grammar of reality. The principle was the same. Stop defending yourself against the depth. Let the depth come and be present enough and structured enough that the depth does not simply drown you but has something to press against, something to fill, something to use as the shape of its message. He opened himself to the Emperor's presence. The scale of it was not the problem. He had prepared for the scale. The problem, the thing he had not fully anticipated, was the texture. The Emperor's consciousness was not organized the way that Asgardian divine minds were organized, not structured in the hierarchical, the mythologically coherent architecture that 10,000 years of Norse cosmological tradition had given Odin's own cognition. It had been built across 150,000 years of human experience, accumulating frameworks and languages and philosophical structures from every civilization it had touched, synthesizing them into something that was simultaneously deeply human and entirely beyond human. A mind so vast and so densely layered that navigating it was less like reading and more like trying to understand a planet by standing on its surface. And it was damaged. Deeply, extensively, heartbreakingly damaged. Not in the way that injury damages a mind, not holes or absences or the clean severances of trauma. Damage in the way that a fire damages a library, not destroying the knowledge but making the access to it uncertain, with the connections between thoughts increasingly unreliable. The pathways that linked one understanding to another, scorched and fragile and prone to collapse under the weight of use. 10,000 years of the Golden Throne had not diminished the Emperor's intelligence or his awareness. It had destroyed his ability to communicate it. Every attempt to reach outward, every pulse toward his sons, toward his servants, toward anyone who might hear, cost something structural. A bridge burned to send a signal. A pathway collapsed to form a word. He had been trying to talk for 10,000 years, and the trying had been destroying him faster than the throne. Odin moved through the damaged library with the care of a being that had spent an eternity learning how to navigate the spaces between knowing and not knowing. He did not push. Well, he did not demand. He moved the way he had learned to move in Mimir's Well, in the dark water at the base of the World Tree, in every space where wisdom existed in a form that required adaptation rather than extraction. Gently, with the patience of something that understood that the thing being sought would only reveal itself to an approach that deserved it. He found the message on the third attempt. Not words, not images precisely. A shape, a complex, multidimensional shape that communicated in the way that mathematics communicates, not through sequential language, but through the simultaneous apprehension of a complete structure. Odin held it in his mind the way he had once held the runes, feeling the shape of it, the weight of it, the implications radiating outward from its core, the way roots radiate from a living thing. He understood it in approximately 4 seconds. The understanding hit him with the force of something that should have staggered him, and did not only because he had, across an extremely long existence, developed the specific capacity to absorb terrible clarity without flinching. He withdrew from the contact carefully, the withdrawal as important as the entry, closing the connection gently to avoid damaging the fragile pathways he had navigated. He opened his eye. He was still sitting cross-legged before the throne, Gungnir across his knees. The Grey Knights librarians were in various states of psychic distress at the edges of the room, having felt the contact's edges without being able to fully process what they had experienced. The eldest rune priest was still sitting on the floor with his hands pressed flat against the stone. Jarr and his eyes, when Odin looked at him, had the specific quality of a man who had overheard something he would need a long time to process. Eisenhorn was watching from the wall. Valoris was watching from beside the throne. Both of them were doing the same thing, waiting with the disciplined patience of veterans for Odin to speak. Odin rose from the floor and stood for a moment in the throne room's cold light, and what was in his expression made Eisenhorn, who had spent a century and a half training himself not to flinch at things, want to step backward. "What did he say?" Valoris asked. His voice was very controlled. "He did not say," Odin said. "He showed. There is a difference." He looked at Gungnir for a moment, at the runes along its shaft that predated this universe, and then at the throne. The Golden Throne is failing. Not the machine. The machine is maintained. What is failing is the fundamental psychic architecture that the throne depends on. It was designed for a body that was whole. 10,000 years of use by a body that is not whole has degraded the underlying structure beyond what maintenance can address. He paused. It has between 100 and 300 years of continued function remaining. He knows this. He has known this for 600 years. He has been trying to tell someone since he realized it. The throne room was absolutely silent. "There is a solution," Odin continued. "He showed me that as well. It requires 3 things, none of which are simple, all of which are possible." He looked at Valoris directly. "The first requires the space wolves and the missing Primarch they have been waiting for. And the second requires the Webway, the Emperor's original project, Not destroyed but sealed, accessible if someone with the right understanding of dimensional architecture could reopen the entry point beneath the palace. And the third, he stopped. The third, Eisenhorn pressed. Odin was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that the silence itself became a kind of answer. The third requires me to descend into the warp, he said, into the Imperium itself, to the place where the chaos god's power originates and where the mechanism that is slowly corrupting the throne's psychic foundation is anchored. He looked at his hands, scarred, ancient, bearing in their lines the record of more sacrifices than he could conveniently enumerate. I need to go to the source of the corruption, and I need to change it. From the inside. That's not possible, one of the Grey Knight librarians said from the edge of the room. His voice was careful. Nothing enters the warp's deep structure and returns. The chaos gods would... Yes, Odin said. They would. He looked at the librarian. That is why it must be done while they are occupied elsewhere. He looked at Eisenhorn. How quickly can you get a message to Logan Grimnar? In the deep warp, far beyond the shallow currents that mortal ships navigated, in the lightless fundamental spaces where the chaos god's power pooled in its most concentrated and primordial form, something stirred. Not Sinch this time. Sinch was watching, had been watching. His attention threads wrapped around this moment with the specific intensity of a being that had foreseen something approaching, and was now watching it arrive with the satisfaction of a scholar proven right, and the anxiety of one who knows that being right about a thing does not mean controlling it. What stirred was older than Sinch's current interest, older than the proxy assault, older than the black ship transit and the confrontation at the viewport. In his brass fortress at the warp's red heart, Khorne became aware that a god of war had stood in the most sacred space of the civilization he had spent 10,000 years trying to destroy, and had done so without a single death, without a single drop of blood spilled, without violence of any kind. The blood god found this personally offensive in a way that 10,000 years of chaos war had not managed to achieve. His roar shook the Immaterium from its shallow surface to its lightless deep, and Nurgle, in his garden of beautiful rot, opened his vast eyes and looked toward Terra with an expression that, on a human face, might have been called hunger. The specific hunger of a god who had been offering his gift of peaceful acceptance to a burning, striving, refusing consciousness for 10 millennia, and had never once been taken up on it. The Allfather had arrived in their garden, and he had brought the smell of living wood. The preparation took 4 days, not because 4 days was sufficient. It was not remotely, not for what Odin was proposing to do. Descending into the deep warp was not a thing that could be adequately prepared for in 4 days, or 4 years, or 4 centuries. It was the kind of undertaking that existed in a category beyond preparation, where the most that readiness could accomplish was ensuring that the being attempting it arrived with the clearest possible understanding of what they were walking into, and the most honest possible assessment of whether they could walk back out. 4 days was what they had. Khorne's influence had begun manifesting on Terra within 18 hours of the blood god's awareness fixing on the throne room. Not directly, the chaos gods could not simply reach through the warp and act on real space at will, not without vectors, not without the specific channels that ritual and corruption and prolonged exposure created. But the vectors existed on Terra as they existed everywhere in the Imperium, in the hearts of men and women under sufficient pressure, in the cracks that 10,000 years of grinding desperate survival had opened in the souls of even the most faithful. Arbite's reports from the lower hive levels began coming in. Coordinated violence, spontaneous and apparently leaderless, in the specific pattern that chaos-aligned murder adopted when it was being directed by something that didn't need to issue orders so much as amplify existing inclinations. Khorne did not plan. Khorne pointed. Nurgle's influence was subtler and in some ways worse. A new strain of something, not quite a biological pathogen, not quite a psychic contagion, on occupying the uncomfortable category between the two that the Mechanicus's biologist divisions had no adequate classification for, had been detected in 3 of Terra's Medici facilities within 36 hours. Not spreading aggressively, moving slowly, deliberately, in the way that Nurgle's gifts always moved, with the patient confidence of a thing that understood that time was always ultimately on its side. Slaanesh had not moved yet. This was, by universal consensus of everyone who discussed it, more alarming than if the Prince of Pleasure had acted immediately. Odin spent the 4 days in 3 ways. The first, in the vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, in the spaces that the Mechanicus had maintained across 10,000 years, with the devotion of a religion whose holy texts were engineering schematics, he studied what remained of the Emperor's Webway project. It was sealed, as he had told Eisenhorn. Not destroyed, merely closed, the entry point collapsed inward and warded against access with protections that had been installed in the immediate aftermath of Magnus's catastrophic message and had never been revisited, because revisiting them would have required acknowledging that the project had existed, which the official imperial theology had decided was inconvenient. The wards were impressive. They were also, Odin noted, wards designed to keep things out of the Webway, rather than things in, a distinction that mattered, because what he needed was not to enter the Webway, but to confirm that it was still intact, still functional, still available as the alternative transit network the Emperor had designed it to be. It was. Had damaged in places, yes. The consequences of 10,000 years of neglect and the ongoing instability of the surrounding warp space were visible in the structural integrity of the passages he could assess remotely, but intact, salvageable, with the right application of dimensional engineering applied by beings who understood both the Webway's fundamental architecture and the warp space pressures currently acting against it. He filed this understanding away with the specific satisfaction of a craftsman confirming that a damaged tool can still be repaired. The second way he spent the 4 days, with the Grey Knights. This was Eisenhorn's suggestion, and it was a good one. And the Grey Knights were the Imperium's most sophisticated practitioners of anti-chaos psychic warfare, beings who had devoted their entire existence to understanding the warp's fundamental nature well enough to fight it directly. They did not have Odin's cosmological breadth or his accumulated wisdom, but they had something he genuinely lacked. 10,000 years of specific, practical, operationally tested knowledge about how the chaos gods functioned in the deep warp, how their domains were structured, where the boundaries of their power were softest, and what the deep immaterium did to beings that entered it without the specific psychic defenses the Grey Knights maintained. He learned from them with the uncomplicated directness of a being who had long ago shed the pride that made learning from others feel like diminishment. They, to in turn, learned from him in ways that would not fully manifest for years, seeds planted in the philosophical foundations of their understanding that would grow in directions none of them could currently map. The Brotherhood champion, who had arrived on Fenris with his force halberd raised and his containment formation perfectly executed, a man named Aldrich, whose life had been devoted so completely to the destruction of chaos that he had never previously spent 4 days in conversation with something that was not a Grey Knight, a senior inquisitor, or a target, sat with Odin on the third night and asked the question that had been building in him since the Fang. "Do you believe the chaos gods can be defeated?" Aldrich asked. "Permanently, fundamentally, not suppressed or driven back or contained, and ended." Odin considered the question with the respect it deserved. "No," he said, "not while the conditions that created them exist. The warp is made of mortal emotion. As long as mortal beings feel rage and despair and desire and hope, corrupted into obsession, the chaos gods will be fed. Killing them would require killing every feeling ever felt, which would require killing every being that feels." He paused. "But defeated is not the only alternative to destroyed. A thing can be diminished, bounded, reduced from existential threat to manageable danger. That is not nothing." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like accepting failure." "It sounds like understanding the difference between what is possible and what is wished for," Odin said. "A warrior who fights only for total victory or total defeat is a warrior who has guaranteed one of those two outcomes. A warrior who can accept partial victory, a line held, a population saved, a flame kept burning against a darkness that cannot be eliminated but can be kept back, is a warrior who can fight indefinitely." He looked at the Brotherhood champion. Which kind of war do you think you are in? Aldrich did not answer immediately. When he did, it was in a quieter voice. The second kind. Yes, Odin said. And you have been fighting it well, for 10,000 years, with no prospect of final victory, sustained by purpose and faith and the specific, costly courage of beings who know the darkness is permanent and light the candle anyway. Something in his expression shifted toward what, in a less ancient face, he might have been called warmth. Do not mistake my admiration for comfort. I am telling you it is hard because it is hard. But hard and hopeless are not the same thing. The third way he spent the 4 days, preparing for what he was about to do. This preparation was internal and largely invisible. It looked to external observers like sitting in silence. It was not sitting in silence. It was the specific work of a being that had learned, across an extremely long existence, that the most important battles were always fought first in the self, that the outer conflict was only ever as stable as the inner one that preceded it. He was doing the work of certainty, not the false certainty of a being that had convinced itself it could not fail, but the real certainty of a being that had looked honestly at the possibility of failure and decided that the attempt was worth the cost regardless. He had hung on Yggdrasil for 9 days with a spear through his side. He had given his eye to Mimir's well. He had sacrificed things that the myths had names for, and things the myths had not recorded because some sacrifices were too personal to mythologize. He understood, in a way that no being could understand without having done it, what it meant to pay a price you could not predict in advance for a knowledge you could not be certain would be sufficient. Away he was going to descend into the deep warp, into the primordial Imperium, where the chaos god's power was not a presence, but a fundamental condition of the environment. And he was going to find the mechanism the Emperor had shown him, the corruption point, the place where 10,000 years of chaos pressure had found purchase on the psychic architecture of the Golden Throne's underlying structure, the anchor that was slowly pulling the throne's function apart from beneath. He was going to find it and change it, not destroy it. The Grey Knights had been very clear about why direct destruction was not available as a strategy in the deep warp. But change it, displace it. Use the Sider's fundamental capacity to alter the underlying grammar of a reality, to rewrite the structural connection between the corruption and the throne before it completed its work. This required him to be in the deep warp, surrounded by the concentrated essence of 4 gods, who were each larger than most civilizations, and who had, collectively, already demonstrated significant interest in destroying him, for long enough to find and modify a specific psychic structure anchored somewhere in the Imperium's least accessible geography. The Grey Knights had a number for this. The number was, there is no number for this. On the 4th day, Logan Grimnar arrived on Terra. He had not been sent for. Odin had told Eisenhorn to send a message, not a request, Suno, and the message had simply contained the outline of the situation without instructions. Grimnar had interpreted this with the pragmatic efficiency of a military commander who understood that being told the situation was the same as being asked what he intended to do about it. He had brought 40 space wolves, a rune priest whose visions had become too specific to ignore, and the specific energy of a man who had been waiting a very long time for something to do and had just been handed a direction. He found Odin in the vaults beneath the palace, studying the sealed Webway entrance. The rune priest, Grimnar said without preamble. Stormcaller. He's been speaking in that language for 4 days. We finally got a full translation. He held out a data slate. It's a location, somewhere in the Eye of Terror. The coordinates are consistent with an area the navigators call the Blind Labyrinth, a deep warp region with no stable entry point. Odin looked at the coordinates. He looked at them for a long time. That, he said quietly, is where Lehman Russ went. The vaults were very quiet. We know, Grimnar said. His voice was the specific texture of a man carrying something very heavy and being very deliberate about not putting it down. We've known the region for 2,000 years. We've never been able to reach it. The warp currents around the Blind Labyrinth are... He stopped. They're not navigable. Not by any ship we have. By a ship? No, Odin agreed. He looked at the Webway entrance. The sealed, warded, forgotten project of an emperor who had understood that the warp was an ocean too dangerous to keep sailing. But the Webway is not the warp. It runs adjacent to it, through it in some places, but separated from it by the structural boundaries the old ones built. He placed his hand against the sealed entrance. The runes on Gungnir pulsed once. A being traveling the Webway to a point adjacent to the blind labyrinth would not need to navigate the warp currents. They would only need to exit at the right point. Grimnar stared at him. You're going to reopen the Webway. Partially, Odin said. Enough for one passage. For two travelers. Two, Grimnar said. You and me, said a voice from behind them. Eisenhorn stood at the vault's entrance. He had been there, Odin suspected, yet for longer than he had made himself visible. The Inquisitor's specific skill was the ability to be present without announcing himself until announcement served a purpose. His expression was the particular expression of a man who has made a decision he is not entirely comfortable with and has decided that discomfort is not a sufficient reason to unmake it. You need someone who knows the warp from the operational side, Eisenhorn said. Someone who has been in its currents before and come back. Someone with enough psychic capability to be useful, but not so much that they become a beacon. He paused. And you need someone who can tell the Inquisition what happened afterward, because if you go in there alone and do something that changes the fundamental structure of the Imperium, the Imperium is going to need an account from someone they consider a credible witness. Odin looked at him for a long moment. You understand what the deep warp does to mortal beings, Odin said. Yes, Eisenhorn said. You understand that the protections I can provide will be substantial, but not absolute. Yes. You understand that we may encounter all four chaos gods in their own domain, in concentrated forms that make their manifestations in real space look like shadows. Yes, Eisenhorn said. I've spent 150 years encountering things that killed everyone around me and coming back to write the report. I've gotten quite good at it. A pause. And the Emperor trusted you enough to show you what was needed. I find I trust his judgment, even expressed through 10,000 years of psychic static. That's enough for me. Odin studied him with his single eye, the eye that had given up its companion for the sake of seeing more clearly. What it saw in Eisenhorn was the same thing it had seen in Grimnar, in Aldrich, in the eldest rune priest, in every custodian standing their 10,000-year vigil. The specific quality of a human being that had found the thing worth doing and had committed to it with the specific, mortal, irreplaceable courage of beings who could die and chose the right thing anyway. He sometimes thought that this was what the Emperor had seen in humanity, the thing worth becoming a god to protect. Then we go, Odin said. Tomorrow, at dawn. In his garden, Nurgle smiled at nothing in particular and began to hum a little louder. The Webway opened like a wound remembering itself. And the Odin satyr met the sealed entrance in the palace vaults not with force, but with recognition. The specific, precise recognition of a being that understood dimensional architecture well enough to speak to it directly, to find the language in which the seal had been written and address it in kind, not breaking the ward, explaining to it that the emergency it had been installed to contain was less dangerous than the emergency it was currently preventing access to. The distinction was fine enough that most magical systems would not have been capable of making it. The cider made it. The entrance opened in silence, which was somehow more profound than if it had opened with noise. A passage, not dark, not light, something between the two that had no adequate name in any language currently spoken, extending inward at an angle that did not correspond to any of the three spatial dimensions available in the vault around it. Webway geometry operated on principles that made navigator math look simple. The passages ran between real space and the warp without touching either, threaded through the dimensional membrane between them, like stitching through fabric, and had been built by a civilization so far in advance of anything currently existing in the galaxy that the Mechanicus's most senior Archmagos, shown a cross-section of the structural engineering, had reportedly sat in silence for 2 days before concluding that the math involved was not math he recognized. Odin stepped through first. Eisenhorn followed. In his expression, the specific expression of a man who has committed to a course of action and is managing the physiological symptoms of commitment through the application of professional focus. The Webway passage closed behind them. Inside, the geometry was disorienting in a way that bypassed conscious processing and went directly to the body's most primitive navigational instincts, the ones that had evolved to handle 3 dimensions and were now being asked to manage several more. Eisenhorn had been in the warp before. The Webway was not the warp. The warp was chaos, given psychic form, constantly shifting, constantly pressing. The Webway was order imposed on the space between realities. Rigid, geometric, alien in the specific way that very old and very sophisticated engineering is alien to beings that did not build it. Wesh, it felt like walking through mathematics. Hugin and Munin had come through after all, Odin noted with something that was not quite surprise. They had refused the throne room. They had not refused this. Perhaps the distinction was meaningful. The Emperor's presence was too vast for them to exist comfortably alongside, but the Webway's structured neutrality was something they could navigate. They flew ahead along the passage, charting the route through a network that had not been actively traversed in 10,000 years, finding the paths that remained structurally intact and the ones that had collapsed under the geological pressure of warp storms pressing against the membrane from outside. The journey through the Webway to a point adjacent to the blind labyrinth took 6 hours by Eisenhorn's chronometer. Though time in the Webway had a specific unreliability that meant those 6 hours corresponded to an indeterminate period in real space, somewhere between 4 hours and several days, depending on variables that Eisenhorn had stopped trying to calculate after the first hour and had filed under the general heading of acceptable uncertainty. They spoke little, not from tension, or not only from tension, but from the specific quality of the Webway's silence, which was not the absence of sound so much as the presence of something that sound would have been inadequate to fill. Occasionally, Eisenhorn asked questions. Occasionally, Odin answered them. At one point, in a section of passage where the membrane between Webway and warp was thin enough that the Imperium's light, such as it was, red-tinged and wrong, was visible through what might generously be called walls, Eisenhorn asked the question that had been building in him since the throne room. If you change the corruption anchor, Eisenhorn said, if you do what the Emperor showed you, what does it actually accomplish? The throne is still failing. The degradation continues. It slows it, Odin said, significantly. The corruption anchor has been accelerating the throne's deterioration by a factor the Emperor estimated at approximately 30%. Remove it, and the throne's remaining functional lifespan extends from 1 to 3 centuries to something significantly longer. Not indefinitely, but long enough. Long enough for what? For the other 2 solutions, Odin said. The Webway once understood and restored, not by me. And I can open a single passage, but the full restoration requires the engineering capacity of the Mechanica supplied with the right understanding, which I will give them. Gives the Imperium an alternative transit network that does not feed the warp every time a ship uses it, reduces the Chaos God's power base incrementally, over centuries, meaningfully. And the first solution, Eisenhorn said, Leman Russ. Yes, you believe he's alive. The rune priest coordinates are specific enough to be navigational data, not symbolic language, Odin said. Someone sent those coordinates. The only being with both the knowledge and the reason to do so is the Primarch himself. He paused. He has been in the blind labyrinth for 10,000 years. Whatever he found there, whatever kept him, he has decided that now is the time to be found. Eisenhorn absorbed this. What does a returning Primarch accomplish that Guilliman hasn't? Guilliman is rebuilding the Imperium's military and administrative capacity, Odin said. Necessary, critical, not sufficient. What is also needed is something that addresses the psychic dimension, the warp itself, the Chaos God's power base, the fundamental imbalance between the Imperium's material strength and its spiritual vulnerability. He looked ahead along the passage where Hugin was banking through a structural arch in the geometry. Leman Russ went into the Eye of Terror to find something specific. He does not do things without reasons. In whatever he found or will find in the blind labyrinth, whatever 10,000 years in the deep warp has done to a Primarch's already considerable psychic constitution, will be relevant to that dimension of the problem. He did not say. I think Russ went to find what I am going to find. He did not need to. Eisenhorn was too experienced to miss the implication. The exit point appeared as a darkening in the passage's geometry, a place where the Webway membrane was close enough to the blind labyrinth's exterior boundary that the structural pressure from outside was visible as a kind of weight, a gravitational wrongness that pressed on the passage's walls from one side. Hugin and Munin returned to Odin's shoulders simultaneously and pressed close in a way that communicated, without words, that they were going to stay there. Odin opened the exit point. The deep warp came in like a tide. Not through the opening. The sighter held the boundary well enough to prevent direct intrusion. But the presence of it came through the way that the presence of an ocean comes through a sealed porthole. Felt rather than admitted, the weight of something vast and encompassing pressing against the membrane of the exit point from every direction simultaneously. The blind labyrinth earned its name. It was a region of the deep immaterium where the chaos gods' overlapping domains created interference patterns in the warp's underlying structure, canceling each other's organizing principles and producing a space that was navigable by nothing that depended on any of those principles for its orientation. Nothing except, apparently, something that carried its own cosmological framework. Odin stepped out of the Webway into the deep warp. The experience was not describable in terms that presupposed a stable physical environment, because there was no stable physical environment. There was instead a space organized entirely by will, the will of the entities whose domains converged here, overlapping and interfering, and whatever individual will of being carried with them into this space. The strong organized the weak, the vast ate the small, the ancient shaped the recent. These were not metaphors. They were the literal physics of the place. Odin organized himself around the Odin force with the deliberate care of a man constructing a shelter in a storm, not resisting the environment, not trying to impose his cosmological framework on a space that would not accept it, but finding the specific quality of his own being that was most fundamental and holding it clearly enough that the warp's organizational pressure could find nothing to rewrite. He existed here as himself, completely and without negotiation. He held Eisenhorn inside that organization with the care of a being that understood the precise difference between what a mortal psychic could endure and what he could not. The corruption anchor was visible almost immediately, not with physical eyes. There was nothing here that corresponded to light in any conventional sense, but visible to the satyr, to the specific perception that had been trained by an eye given to a well and 9 days on a tree, and 1,000 sacrifices of lesser note. Visible as a wrongness in the deep warp structural fabric, would a place where 10,000 years of deliberate pressure had found a hairline crack in the psychic architecture underlying the golden throne, and had been widening it with the patient, geological efficiency of water working on stone. It was enormous, not in the way that the chaos gods were enormous, not a living enormity, not a conscious force. More like a weather system, a sustained pattern of psychic pressure that had achieved self-reinforcing stability, feeding itself from the ambient chaos energy of the surrounding deep warp, pressing constantly against its target with a force that was not dramatic but was entirely, relentlessly effective. He moved toward it, and the warp moved against him. Not the corruption anchor, the gods. Khorne came first, as Khorne always did, because patience was not a concept that the blood god engaged with meaningfully. He came not as a figure, not in the deep warp, where physical form was a choice, and the gods were beyond making that choice for their own domain, but as a force, a roaring directional pressure that carried in it every death that rage had ever caused, compressed into something that pressed against Odin's, being like a wall of burning brass. The demand was absolute and wordless, blood or submission, and submission still required blood. Odin met Khorne's force with Gungnir, not as a weapon. Gungnir in the deep warp was not a physical spear, was not a material object of any kind. It was an intention made fundamental, the specific ancient intention of a spear that never misses, that always finds its mark, that was made to be thrown and always returns. And in the deep warp, intention was structure, and structure was power, and the intention encoded in Gungnir had been old when the chaos gods were young. It met Korn's roaring brass wall not by stopping it, but by going through it, finding the single point in every wall where a spear with absolute conviction could pass, and passing. Korn's force faltered, not stopped, never stopped. Rage did not stop, but faltered, redirected, losing its organizational coherence against something that would not be organized by it. Nurgle came slower, as Nurgle always did, because Nurgle understood that time was his primary weapon and saw no reason to abandon an effective strategy. May he came as a sensation of profound and beautiful tiredness, not the sharp tiredness of exhaustion, but the deep tiredness of a being that has been doing something very hard for a very long time and is being offered, finally, permission to stop. The offer was genuine, in the way that Nurgle's gifts were always genuine. He did not lie about what he was offering. He was offering rest, the specific permanent rest of a thing that had given up the exhausting work of existing distinctly and had dissolved into the warm, inclusive rot of everything that had ever lived. Odin recognized the gift because he had seen it in the faces of mortal warriors who had fought too long. He recognized the pull of it, not for himself, but recognized it the way that a healer recognizes a fever, from the outside, with both compassion for the sufferer and clarity about the necessity of refusing it. "Not today," he said to Nurgle. The words existed here as intention as much as sound. "Not any day. There is still work." Nurgle's sensation withdrew, with something that was not quite sadness and not quite patience. The specific emotional register of a god who has been refused before and is accustomed to waiting. Slaanesh came last and came sideways, which was characteristic. The Prince of Pleasure did not come as force or as tiredness. Slaanesh came as the specific temptation of a being that understood, with terrible precision, exactly what each individual wanted most. And what it offered Odin was not sensation or power or rest, but knowledge. Pure, unfiltered, complete knowledge, the kind that Odin had sacrificed an eye for a fraction of, laid on a tree for a fragment of, paid every price he had ever paid for the pieces of. Everything, all of it, the complete understanding of this universe, its past and future, every secret held in every mind across every world, every truth concealed in every lie, every answer to every question Odin had ever spent centuries pursuing. Offered freely, no price named, just the knowing. It was the most sophisticated trap Odin had ever encountered, which was a meaningful distinction. "The price," Odin said to Slaanesh, "is always named. It is simply named in the enjoying rather than the accepting." He looked at the sensation of infinite knowledge being offered and recognized in it the specific quality of a gift designed to make the receiver need more of it. The knowledge would be real, and it would be enough to addict. Much in the addiction would be the price. "I have spent my existence learning things the hard way, because things learned the hard way are things that belong to the learner. What you are offering belongs only to you." Slaanesh withdrew. In the relative quiet of three chaos gods' retreated attention, temporary, certainly, rebuilding for another assault, Odin reached the corruption anchor. He studied it with the sighter for 60 seconds, which was as long as he had before Korn's rebuilt pressure returned and the other three reasserted their interest. In those 60 seconds, he understood the anchor's structure completely, the specific way in which 10,000 years of deliberate psychic pressure had woven itself into the throne's underlying architecture, the points where it was load-bearing and the points where it was merely reinforcing, the fundamental grammar of its construction and the fundamental grammar of what it was constructed against. He began to change it. This was not dramatic either. No visible force, no blinding light, no operatic display of cosmic power. The cider worked the way the deepest magic always worked, in the grammar layer, beneath the visible surface, in the place where reality's sentences were formed before they became the events that people witnessed and remembered. He was not destroying the corruption anchor. You could not destroy a warp structure anchored in the deep immaterium any more than you could destroy an ocean current. He was changing its direction, slightly, precisely, taking the 10,000-year accumulation of pressure that had been aimed at the throne's psychic foundation and redirecting it, not at the chaos gods, not as a weapon pointed anywhere specific, but simply sideways, into the warp's own ambient structure, where it would disperse like dye in water, losing its organizational coherence, becoming part of the background noise of the Imperium, rather than a directed force against a specific target. Korn's rebuilt wall hit him mid-process. He held. The Odin force blazed, not with the controlled, managed luminescence he had been maintaining since his arrival in this universe, not the gold coal glow visible at his cloak's edges, but the full, uncontained expression of 10,000 years of accumulated cosmic power. The divine capacity of a being that had spent an eternity becoming exactly what the situation required. It blazed like a star that had been saving itself, like Yggdrasil's roots reaching to depths beyond the void. They're like the specific and terrible and necessary brightness of a god who had chosen, fully and without reservation, to spend what he had spent a very long time accumulating. The chaos gods pushed. Odin did not push back. He held and finished the work, and the corruption anchor came apart in the deep warp, with the specific quiet of something that had been wrong for a very long time, finally ceasing to be wrong. Then he grabbed Eisenhorn, who had been standing inside the Odin force's protection with the expression of a man watching geological processes occur at human speed, and moved. Not through the Webway, the exit point was behind them, and behind them was where three reasserting chaos gods and one curious one were concentrating their attention. He moved instead through the warp itself, burning the Odin force like a torch against the dark, holding Eisenhorn inside the light with the specific, costly care of a being that had committed to bringing someone back and was honoring the commitment at whatever price the honoring required. The price was significant. He felt it as he moved. Not pain, not in any sense that the word pain adequately captured, but the specific sensation of spending something that did not immediately replenish. The Odin force was not a finite resource in the conventional sense, but very few things were truly infinite. And the deep warp was the most expensive environment he had ever operated in. And the four simultaneous assaults of beings who were each larger than most civilizations had cost more than the accounting would fully tally until later. Later. They came out of the warp into real space approximately 40 kilometers above Terra's surface, which caused immediate and comprehensive excitement among the planet's orbital defense network, and Odin held them both stable against the atmospheric entry that followed. Not gracefully, not with the controlled elegance he would have preferred. And they came down in the Sanctum Imperialis gardens like something that had fallen a very long way and was extremely glad to have stopped falling. Eisenhorn lay on his back in the garden's ancient dust and looked at the ochre sky above Terra for a long moment. "We're alive," he said. "Yes," Odin said. He was sitting beside the Inquisitor on the dust, and he was breathing with a deliberateness that suggested the breathing required attention. Hugin and Munin were on his shoulders. Both of them pressed against his neck in the specific way that suggested the ravens were performing their own accounting of what the journey had cost. "Did it work?" Eisenhorn asked. Odin turned his single eye toward the palace, toward the throne room buried in its depths, toward the burning presence that even from here was perceptible to his perception as the dim, sustained, irreducibly present light of something that had been burning for 10,000 years and would now burn longer. The burning was steadier. "Yes," he said. In the throne room, the attending tech priest noted simultaneously that 17 different diagnostic instruments had registered a change in the Golden Throne's psychic load metrics. Small but consistent, and in a direction that the instruments had not previously recorded movement in the entire span of their operational history. The change was upward. 3 weeks after the deep warp, Odin could lift Gungnir without effort again. This was a useful benchmark. The spear was not heavy in any physical sense. It had no meaningful mass in real space, existing more as a condensed intention than a material object. What it required to lift was not muscle, but the specific structural integrity of a divine being operating at full capacity, the kind of wholeness that the deep warp's assault had temporarily and significantly disrupted. The first week after Terra, he had carried Gungnir at his side rather than in his hand. which Hugin had noted with the specific avian disapproval of a raven that understood symbolism and found the current symbolism inadequate. The second week, he had managed brief periods of proper carry before the drain became noticeable. The third week, standing in the Sanctum Imperialis gardens where they had landed, he lifted it cleanly and felt the Odin force move through it, the way current moves through a complete circuit. And Munin made a sound that was approximately the raven equivalent of relief. The Imperium in those 3 weeks had been working. Eisenhorn's report had gone to the Inquisitorial Conclave at a classification level that technically did not exist, which meant approximately 40 people read it within 72 hours. This was, by Inquisitorial standards, excellent operational security. And the report contained 3 things: a complete account of the Webway passage and the deep warp operation, a technical description of the corruption anchor structure, and its removal sufficient for the Mechanicus's senior archmagi to understand what had been done and why the throne's diagnostic metrics had changed. In a separate sealed addendum addressed specifically to Robot Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium, marked for his eyes and no other. Guilliman had read the addendum in private and had then spent 6 hours in the throne room alone, which the custodians had permitted with the resigned acceptance of beings that had learned, across 10,000 years, that Primarchs were going to do what Primarchs were going to do. And the most productive response was to guard the perimeter and let it happen. He emerged from the throne room with the expression of a man who had been given a document that reorganized everything he thought he understood about his current strategic situation, and who was processing the reorganization with the systematic efficiency of one of the greatest military and administrative minds humanity had ever produced. He had requested a meeting with Odin for the following morning. The meeting had lasted 9 hours. What was said in it remained between the two of them and the throne room stones, which kept secrets better than any classification system. Nana, what emerged from it publicly was a series of decisions that rippled outward through the Imperium's command structure with the specific velocity of decisions made by someone with the authority to make them without committee. The Mechanicus Archmagi were given Odin's technical assessment of the Webway's current structural state and the preliminary architectural analysis he had conducted during the 4 preparatory days. The reaction of the senior Archmagos Dominus, a being of such extreme mechanical modification that the word human applied to him primarily as a historical designation, was the closest thing to excitement that his cognitive architecture could currently express, which manifested as 17 minutes of uninterrupted binary cant that his aides described afterward as unprecedented in its enthusiasm. 8 teams were being organized. The project that had been sealed for 10,000 years was being reopened, carefully, with the specific reverence of engineers who understood they were working on something their greatest predecessor had built and trusted them to complete. Logan Grimnar, who had spent the 3 weeks on Terra with his 40 space wolves rather than returning to Fenris, came to the gardens on the morning that Odin lifted Gungnir cleanly, and stood beside him for a moment watching the palace's towers disappear into the ochre cloud cover. Stormcaller's visions have changed, Grimnar said. How? He was speaking the coordinates in a loop, Grimnar said. Same location, same language, repeated. He stopped repeating them the morning after you came back from the warp. He started speaking something else. The great wolf's expression was difficult to read, which meant it was carrying more than his face wanted to show. Takes about a day for the Lex mechanics to get a translation. We got it this morning. He held out a data slate. Odin read it. He read it twice. Not because he hadn't understood it the first time, but because some things deserve to be read twice, to be fully received rather than merely processed. The wolf comes home when the tree is ready. Tell the Allfather, I remember the old words. I will know the door when it opens. Lehman Russ. Alive, aware, and waiting for the Webway to give him a path back that didn't require navigating 10,000 years of warp corruption under his own power. He's been in contact with your rune priest this whole time, Odin said. Since before you arrived. We think, Grimnar said. Stormcaller just didn't have the context to understand what was being sent until. He stopped. Until there was something to send it about. Odin handed the data slate back. He looked at the sky for a moment. The ochre, poisoned, beautiful sky of a world that had been dying slowly enough not to notice for 40,000 years, that had 8 billion souls clinging to it with the specific mortal stubbornness of beings that had nowhere else to go, and had decided that was not a sufficient reason to stop. He understood, standing in this garden on this dying world at the heart of this impossible empire, why the emperor had spent 150,000 years doing what he had done. Not the strategy of it. The strategy was legible. The Great Crusade's logic was sound. The Webway project's ambition was comprehensible. He understood the feeling of it, the specific feeling of a being that had looked at humanity, mortal, fragile, loud, inconsistent, magnificent, infuriating humanity, and decided that this was the thing worth building everything else around. He had felt something like it, standing in the mead halls of Midgard 10,000 years before his own mythology's accounting began. He had felt it on Yggdrasil, wounded and fasting, looking down at the 9 worlds that the sacrifice was for. He felt it now, standing in the Sanctum Imperialis gardens, with a great wolf beside him and 2 ravens on his shoulders and a spear in his hand that was working again. The work was not done. It was nowhere near done. And the Chaos Gods had been disrupted but not diminished. The Corruption Anchor's removal had taken a tool from them, not weakened their fundamental power. Khorne's influence in Terra's lower hives had required 3 days of concentrated arbits in Grey Night response to suppress, and it had been suppressed rather than resolved, which was a distinction that mattered. Nurgle's contagion in the medical facilities had been contained by the Mechanicus's biologist teams with the application of techniques developed for exactly this category of threat, but contained was not eliminated. Slaanesh had not moved yet, and the not yet was a thing that required continuous monitoring. The Webway restoration would take decades, possibly longer. The Mechanicus worked at the pace that precision required, and precision was non-negotiable when the alternative was destabilizing the dimensional membrane between real space and the Imperium in the vicinity of Terra. Leman Russ was waiting in the blind labyrinth with 10,000 years of deep warp experience and whatever he had found there, and reaching him required the Webway passage to be extended to a point that would not be accessible for months at minimum. Tzeentch was still watching, was always watching, would always be watching, because that was what Tzeentch was. The watching was not a temporary tactical posture. It was a fundamental condition of the entity's existence. The difference, Odin thought, was that Tzeentch had now seen him refuse to be a piece on the board, was an entities whose nature was the manipulation of fate's threads, developed a specific and useful respect for variables they could not reliably predict. The other 3 Chaos Gods had now personally encountered him in their own domain and been refused, deflected, or outworked. This would not humble them. Gods of their nature did not humble, but it would inform them. They would adjust. They would find new approaches, new vectors, new proxy methods that accounted for what they now understood about him. He would have to adjust too, continuously. It was the nature of the work. Grimnar spoke without looking at him. "What are you going to do now?" Odin was quiet for a moment. "Stay," he said, "for a while. There are things in progress that require watching, and I have 2 ravens that are excellent at watching. He and a Webway that needs overseeing, and a Primarch that needs a door opened when the time comes." He paused. "And there is a conversation I need to have with the Grey Knights about a change in their understanding of the deep warp structural grammar that may make their work significantly more effective over the next several centuries." Grimnar made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a grunt. A sound in the register of a man whose people had been waiting 10,000 years for something, and who was very carefully not attaching too much certainty to the possibility that the waiting was approaching an end. "Space wolves maintain a presence on Terra now," Grimnar said. "Protocol since the gathering storm. Rotating detachment, Fang-trained, full complement." He looked at Odin sidelong. "There's a hall, smaller than the Fang. Once the ale is worse, which I didn't think was possible on Terra. But there's a fire, and there are warriors who know how to keep silence when silence is needed, and noise when noise is needed." "That sounds," Odin said, "exactly like what a hall should be." They stood in the garden for another moment in the specific, comfortable silence of 2 very old warriors who had found, against considerable odds and in an extremely unlikely location, something that felt like the beginning of a thing worth doing. Then Logan Grimnar picked up Morkai and began walking toward the palace, and Odin fell into step beside him, and Hugin lifted from his shoulder and flew ahead, and Munin pressed closer, and Gungnir's runes pulsed once, gold and steady like a coal that had found its proper oxygen and settled into a burn that could last a long time. On the golden throne, 17 diagnostic instruments continued to read the new metric, the one that had not existed in their operational history until 3 weeks ago. The Emperor burned, but the burning was steadier, and in the deep warp, in the lightless spaces where the Chaos Gods rebuilt their strategies and counted their pieces and prepared their next 10,000 years of patient, terrible work, something had changed. A variable had been introduced that did not exist on any of their boards. An old god of wisdom walking the halls of an empire that had forgotten what gods were for. Not sitting on a throne, not bound to a machine, not screaming in the dark, but walking, eyes open, one of them given away for clarity, the other one watching, learning, waiting, working. Nadsencha's attention threads wrapped tighter around the variable and found, for the first time in several millennia, that they could not fully map its trajectory. This was, the changer of ways decided, excellent. The Allfather had arrived in the 41st millennium, and the Imperium, against every probability its enemies had calculated, had gained something it had not possessed in 10,000 years. Something more valuable than fleets, more durable than fortress walls, more dangerous to the dark than any weapon in its armories. A god who was still paying attention. In the Sanctum Imperialis gardens, as the ochre sky turned the particular shade of dying amber that passed for sunset on Terra, a single raven, Hugin, thought itself, landed on the highest parapet of the imperial palace and looked out across the hive city sprawl of mankind's cradle world, with eyes that saw not just the present moment, but the threads of what the present moment was becoming. The threads were not clean. They were never clean. They ran through darkness and loss, and the specific, grinding cost of 10,000 years of a war that had no clean ending available to it. But they ran forward. They continued, and in their continuation was the thing that the Chaos Gods, for all their ancient power and patient malice, had never successfully calculated into their models. The thing that the Emperor had understood well enough to spend 150,000 years protecting, and that Odin recognized from every mead hall and battlefield and moment of hard-won peace he had witnessed across an existence longer than this empire's memory. The stubborn, irreducible, magnificent refusal of living things to stop. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The Allfather had only just begun. The corruption anchor had been displaced. The Webway breathed again in its sealed sleep, dreaming of restoration. Logan Grimnar's ale hall on Terra had a new occupant, who drank carefully and listened more than he spoke, and whose ravens were gone every morning before dawn, ranging across the hive city sprawl, and returning with the specific quality of birds that had seen things worth reporting. Leman Russ waited in the blind labyrinth with the patience of a Primarch who had learned, in 10,000 years of extraordinary circumstance, that patience was not the same as inaction. The Chaos Gods recalculated. The Mechanicus worked. The Grey Knights studied notes that would reshape their understanding of the deep warp over the coming centuries. And on the Golden Throne, the Emperor burned, steadier, longer, with the specific quality of a fire that has been given a little more time and intends to use it well. What Odin would find next, what the Webway would reveal when it opened, what Leman Russ had carried back from a decade of immersion in the warp's deepest places, all of that waited in the space between now and what came next, in the territory that the ravens were already charting, in the dark that the Allfather had decided. With characteristic deliberateness and the wisdom of a being who had been doing this for a very long time, to walk into with his eye open and his spear ready and his hall found and his work,